Next year, in 2026, Halo crosses a groundbreaking milestone. It becomes a quarter of a century old. 25 years. And during that time, we've seen the narrative and the story of the Halo universe grow at an exponential rate. We've gone from being a relatively indescript cyborg and the last of his kind, trudging along the surface of a mysterious ring world, fighting a war against an alien conglomerate that we were ultimately losing, only to find an ancient threat buried on the ring, older and more dangerous than we could possibly have realised, to now having a fully expanded narrative and origin story of the Master Chief Spartan John 117. We know the history and origins of the Covenant, the mysterious race that created the ring worlds. We now know almost all intimate details about them as well. We know how the war between humanity and the Covenant got started. We know the strange connections between the Flood and the creators of our species and many others, the precursors, as well as the lives and exploits of hundreds of individuals across hundreds of thousands of years. I, as with many of us, have been deeply entrenched in the Halo universe for well over 2 decades. And during that time, I've watched the Halo universe expand exponentially. And I've endeavoured to try to understand that expansion, to come to terms with how things have evolved and changed in the Halo universe. And since Halo has passed through the hands of 3 different game studios and hundreds of creative individuals, it's not surprising that occasionally inconsistencies and contradictions are introduced into the narrative. And one of the most enjoyable aspects of what I do on my day-to-day is try to remedy those contradictions, to find ways to explain how one thing can lead to another and bridge the gap of logic between. And now I'm going to present a framework to you that not only fixes many of the contradictions and inconsistencies in Halo's past, but becomes a predictive model for the future of the Halo universe. And the more that you think on it and apply it to the Halo universe, the more it fixes. I'm about to present to you the grand unified theory of Halo's cosmology. This is the Halo theory of everything. Hey everyone, welcome back to Installation 00, and this is going to be a hell of a project. I have fully laid out the grand unified theory of Halo's cosmology. This is a defining fundamental framework that clearly defines and lays out the fundamental basis of the Halo universe, upon which everything that we see in all of the games, all of the books, all of the extended media can be built and explained. The Halo universe has a common history with our real-world history from around 100,000 years ago to the modern day. Everything that happens after the modern day is built upon and extrapolated from the fundamentals of what we already understand about the universe, with some narrative expansions and drama and space opera thrown in for good measure. And everything that happened before 100,000 years ago is almost a retelling or a reimagination of humanity's origin story. Although, if you dig deep enough into some of the conspiracy theories surrounding ancient human cultures, you might find there's actually more in common than you might think. But moving away from that, our understanding of the modern-day universe is based upon scientific consensus. Theories, frameworks, calculations are presented, tested and peer-reviewed, and, if it holds water, eventually come to underpin and define our understanding of the universe. And of course, the holy grail of those discoveries would be the theory of everything, something that the late Professor Stephen Hawking spent his life chasing, and unfortunately never quite got to see it. The theory of everything, also known as the unified field theory, or the ideas of bringing together the theories of the very big and the very small, is a physics framework that aims to describe all fundamental forces and elementary particles within a single, comprehensive framework. It seeks to explain and understand how the four known fundamental forces of gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear forces interact and potentially arise from a single underlying field. Essentially, it's a theory to attempt to unify these forces into a single, overarching concept. And in my recent dives into the deep lore of the Halo universe for some of my more popular videos recently, I came across some interesting bits of information and deep lore that seemed to allow for a specific framework to arise within the Halo universe that becomes the Halo's equivalent of the unified field theory, what I'm calling the grand unified theory of Halo's cosmology. And from it, I've managed to explain some of the major contradictions and inconsistencies surrounding the flood, consciousness permanence, the precursors, neural physics, ancient humanity, and the Forerunners. This unified theory has become a framework upon which the entire Halo universe can be built upon. It explains so much, and the more inconsistencies I find in the deep lore, the more this theory proves to be accurate. But of course, this is such an immense subject that I'm going to have to break this down into several parts. And if there's demand, I'll release a supercut of all of it at the end. So starting today, there's going to be a series of 6 videos that will outline this grand unified theory of Halo's cosmology. So now we will tackle the fundamental framework that underpins the Halo universe, what I'm calling the Cosmological Layer model. Then we will move on to the other respective pieces of this thesis, being the nature of neural physics, the Forerunners' sphere workaround, ancient humanity, the lost rival, the true nature of the flood, and the Bias Fallacy. And at the conclusion of all 6 parts, you will have a clear and complete picture of Halo's cosmology, at which point I effectively submit it to you for peer review. And if it holds water, it could become the fundamental theory beneath the entire Halo universe and become a predictive model for the future. At its core, Halo's reality operates across several stacked or nested layers. These layers represent increasing levels of abstraction, control, and fundamental priority. The deeper you go, the closer you get to modifying not just the contents of reality, but the operating principles of reality itself. Layer 0, the source field, also known as the axiomatic substrate. To parallel the real world, this layer is the most fundamental. This is where the quantum foam, the zero-point energy field, the vacuum energy, it is the underlying field of energy upon which the entire Halo universe can be built. It, just as its real-world analogue, is a Planck-scale substrate. In our real world, there are 4 fundamental forces that exist, that explain and define all of reality. Of those, we have discovered a fundamental force-carrying particle for 3 of them. The photon is the force-carrying particle for the electromagnetic force. The gluon is the force-carrying particle for the strong nuclear force. The W and Z bosons are the force-carrying particles for the weak nuclear force. And to date, gravity continues to elude us. And it really is with gravity where our real-world physics finds its problem. We haven't found the quantum of gravity. There are of course ideas and hypotheses in conventional physics and quantum physics to try to explain gravity, but until such time as we actually know, we cannot develop a theory of everything for the real world. However, in the Halo universe, it seems abundantly clear that gravity does have a force-carrying particle, a hypothesized real-world particle known as the graviton. It's worth noting that there's a possibility that the graviton may exist in the real world. We just haven't discovered it yet because, after all, gravity is the weakest of the fundamental forces, and thus requires exponentially larger machines and detection gear to find something like the graviton. But to give you an idea of just how powerful of a discovery finding the graviton would be, and how powerful it is in the Halo universe, when humanity came to understand the electromagnetic force and the photon, humanity went from candlelight and wood fires to our current real-world civilization with electricity and cars and lights, and the internet, jet airplanes, a space program, and the borderlines of fusion energy in just 200 years. Mankind had been making very slow and gradual progress for 100,000 years, and just in the last 2 centuries has skyrocketed to the civilization you see when you look outside of your window, all from understanding and harnessing the power of the photon. If we were to discover the graviton, we would be able to turn gravity on and off in a location with the flip of a switch. We'd be able to convert energy directly into gravity gradients, and that could pave the way for technical innovations beyond imagining. In the Halo universe, all 4 fundamental forces are quantized. Gluons for the strong force, photons for the electromagnetic force, W and Z bosons for the weak force, and the graviton all exist in a single unified field. This is the source field, the true canvas on which reality is written. Pure potential energy fluctuations, quantum fluctuations, foundational constants, the machine code or firmware of existence. Nothing recognizable exists here, really. It's raw information and energy. It's the battery of the universe. Everything that is possible emerges from this substrate. All of space-time has a quanta. Layer 1 is the neural physics layer. Neural physics is a concept in science championed by the precursors, which posits that the entire universe is alive, but in a manner in which normal life cannot comprehend it. It encompasses all of consciousness, life, matter, and energy in the universe, and that all of those could be harnessed and manipulated through the principles and near transcendent technology of neural physics. It parallels real-world theories and hypotheses surrounding emergent consciousness theories. The idea that consciousness, or the capacity for subjective experience, arises from the complex interactions of a system rather than being a property of its individual components. Panpsychism, a doctrine or belief that everything material, however small, has an element of individual consciousness, even if it doesn't objectively display it. The Penrose-Hameroff quantum consciousness model, which proposes that consciousness arises from quantum processes within microtubules in brain neuron, suggesting that these processes, specifically the collapse of quantum states, are orchestrated by gravitational forces and lead to conscious experiences. And living time models, also known as temporal holism, being the idea that time may be more fluid and interconnected than we typically perceive it, and suggests that experience can exist outside of the usual temporal sequence, and that the present moment is not just a snapshot in a linear progression, but a point of connection to all of time. At its most fundamental, the neural physics layer is the emergence of universal patterns that govern reality's rules, the laws of physics, the constants, the causalities. Consciousness may not emerge within this layer, but rather is this layer. The idea that the universe itself is alive, but in a manner we cannot perceive it. Living time, being time as a stateful property of pattern interaction rather than simple entropy. And when interacting with the neural physics layer, will and intent can manipulate this layer directly, which adversely affect true reality. A simplified concept being that the neural physics layer is the software layer of existence, where informational structures define what reality can be, and conscious will operates here. The suggestion from the precursors being that this living consciousness of the universe is where all conscious beings pull their consciousness from. It's where consciousness originates, and it's where consciousness returns when the physical dies. It is the before and afterlife. It is the creator. It is, in its simplest sense, God, unspoiled and independent of the machinations of man, beast, or indeed alien. The precursor's mastery of neural physics as a technology and science concept, and thus their interaction with the neural physics layer, meant they were effectively at one with the universe. It is why time, entropy, birth and death were inconsequential to the precursors, because they knew that physical death didn't mean true, permanent consciousness death. It simply meant that they returned to the neural physics layer, to the universal consciousness, and since the neural physical layer underpins all of reality, they could will themselves back into existence. The neural physics layer rests on top of the source field, and the source field's incredible energy is siphoned through to the neural physics layer, with the neural physics layer itself giving rise to the universal patterns that govern reality's rules, and ultimately gives rise to the next layer. Layer 2 is the dimensional control layer. The closest real-world analogues are simply higher dimensions, string theory, M-theory's 10 and 11 dimensions of space, brain cosmology, the 4th, 5th and 6th dimensions and beyond. Hyperdimensionality. Basically the idea that our experience of the universe is 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension. Combined means we live in a 4-dimensional universe, 3 dimensions in 1 direction of time. But that true reality is made of lots of dimensions above our conceptual understanding. There are many different interpretations of what these dimensions are, with some saying that they are compact or curled up, rendering them undetectable to us, with others referencing that it is a space between spaces. All that is common among all of them is that we lack the physical capability to accurately perceive them. The Forerunners were masters of the dimensional control layer. They were masters of slipstream space. This is, in the Halo universe, the hyperdimensional planes of reality. With their mastery of slipspace control, the Forerunners could control geometric structures of space-time itself, and allowed the manipulation of time dilation, stasis, non-linear travel, and relative causal isolation. Access to hyperdimensional transit routes, also known as slipspace translocation. From the Forerunners' mastery of the dimensional control layer, they were able to create shield worlds that not only had the radius of 1 astronomical unit, being the distance between Earth and the Sun, but were able to enclose that megastructure into a slipspace rift that in normal space meant that it only occupied the space of a few square meters, whilst also enabling time within this slipspace field to travel at a different rate than outside of the slipspace field. Inside the shield world, hours could pass, meanwhile outside in the rest of the universe, days or weeks could have. It also enabled the Forerunners to create cryptums, basically giant stasis pods that would allow a living Forerunner to exist within it in perpetuity, basically stopping the progression of time entirely. Or on the flip side, and unfortunately for the primordial, be able to create a time prison where entropy could be run in fast forward, forcing the primordial, or whatever occupant is inside, to experience billions of years of entropy in seconds. Conceptually, the dimensional control layer is the interface layer, where advanced manipulation of space-time allows you to isolate, distort, or insulate local reality. Slipspace and hyperdimensionality exist because the neural physical layer laid out the laws of physics and the rules of reality that allow it to exist. Layer 3 is the conventional physical universe. It is exactly as we see it around us: the Newtonian relativistic physics, the observable matter and energy, classical causality, the world we live in, the 3 dimensions of space, and 1 dimension of unidirectional time. All conventional life and physical systems exist here, conceptually almost identical to the application layer, where the written code plays out as a lived reality and exists as a subset of the dimensional control layer. The 3 spatial and 1 temporal dimensions of a conventional physical universe are one of a many nested hyperdimensions of the dimensional control layer. And finally, layer 4 is the synthetic subsystems layer. You can consider this as being practically any computational system in the real world. These are constructed information systems and computers built atop the material world, and is dependent upon physical reality but is increasingly complex, and the normal laws of physics may not directly apply to entities within that system. For example, gravity doesn't particularly matter to an AI within a computational system. Machine code is energy, not really matter, but alas can only exist due to the laws of physics that have been laid out in the previous layers. And that fundamentally lays out the cosmological layer model of the Halo universe, a fully structured framework on how the existence of the Halo universe and its grand cosmology can exist within a bounded framework. And it's clear to see how each layer is directly dependent upon the existence of the one beneath it. Computational systems cannot exist independent of the material universe, the one in which we exist, which itself cannot exist independent from the hyperdimensions of the dimensional control layer. It is a subset of the hyperdimensions, and that layer cannot exist without the neural physical layer laying out the rules and framework upon which it exists. And it cannot exist without the source layer feeding energy directly to it as the fundamental, foundational, and functional basis of the Halo universe, with all of its fundamental forces unified into a single unified field. And it's at this point that I want your input and comments on the cosmological layer model. From my view, it's not just a thematic framework, it's a functional blueprint of sorts. Most fan theories, in sci-fi universes in general, are thematic interpretations. They connect dots and explore narrative meaning, but this feels different. This cosmological layer model isn't just interpretive, it's functional. It explains how the universe operates at nearly every scale, and in the following parts I'll use this model to help connect Halo's time travel paradoxes, domain behavior, flood metaphysics, gravemind persistence, AI corruption, Forerunner architecture, and the precursor extinction and return in one elegant, scalable, internally consistent system. And I hope through this process you'll come to see, as I do, it's not just an analogy, it's the architecture the universe appears to be built on. Neural physics represents the most advanced, mysterious, and consequential science in the Halo universe. It's not simply a form of hypertechnology or an advanced field of physics, it is the operating principle of reality itself, sitting just above the foundational substrate of existence. It was mastered by the precursors, feared by the Forerunners, misunderstood by humanity, and ultimately corrupted through the Flood. In this second episode of the Halo Cosmology project, we deep dive into neural physics, its emergence from the source field, and its role as the blueprint layer of existence. Neural physics exists at layer 1, sitting directly atop the source field at layer 0, which contains the raw energy, quantum fluctuations, and abstract rules of possibility that underpin existence. Neural physics translates these into programmable, manifest patterns. Space, time, consciousness, causality, and entropy are not fixed constants, but fluid phenomena that can be altered or refined. Neural physics seems to suggest that all of reality is composed of neural patterns. These are not brainwaves or synaptic pulses. They are informational matrices that define the behavior of fundamental forces. Neural physics allows the manipulation of consciousness as a field, the encoding of life as a function of informational resonance, the alteration of physical laws through ontological rewriting, and the redefinition of causality, time flow, and memory. At the neural physical layer, will is an operative property. Precursor science implies that consciousness is not emergent from biology, but is a first-order function of reality that can shape neural patterns directly. The precursors did not build machines to affect reality. They thought, and it was so. This is the basis of living time. Time is not linear, but relational to intention and pattern. Causality becomes local, mutable, and non-directional. Due to the nature of neural physics as a function of the universe itself as opposed to a form of technology, entities encoded at layer 1 are substrate independent. That means that a being who is encoded within layer 1 can persist as information even after physical death. Consciousness can reinstantiate in different forms. This is why precursors didn't particularly fight back to the Forerunners when they were attacked. The destruction and death of their physical bodies didn't mean anything to them, because they existed and were encoded at layer 1 within neural physics. And because consciousness can reinstantiate in different forms, and it is ultimately the manipulation of consciousness as a field, and can alter physical laws through ontological rewriting, the precursors could simply will themselves back into existence in whatever form they so chose. This also explains why the precursors could exist in myriad forms. They didn't have a single physical form that defined their species. If anything, their species were so intertwined with neural physics that the precursors nearly became at one with the universe. And it is through this mechanism that constructs such as the domain can not only preserve minds across incredible spans of time, but seemingly contains hundreds of billions of years worth of information. The neural physical layer makes time immutable. The age of the universe, at least in the Halo universe, is assumed to be the same as our real-world universe, being around 13.4 billion years. The domain containing information that spans hundreds of billions of years seems to suggest that the domain existed outside of the boundaries of our normal universe, and thus somehow collated information from other universes. But once you understand the function of the neural physical layer of Halo's cosmology, and the fact that time is immutable, suddenly 100 billion years of information existing within a construct that could have only existed as long as 13.4 billion years is actually because time within the neural physical layer is not linear and can be relational and intentional to pattern. Time becomes non-directional, meaning that experiences happening within the universe aren't bound by time, and that the measurement of 100 billion years worth of information is simply based on the perspective of which it's being observed, which in this specific instance is being observed by the Forerunners, a species who don't exist at the neural physical layer, but in the normal dimensions of space-time, and thus interpret the flow of time linearly. It also explains a great deal more further than this, but I'm going to save those for the subsequent videos to really fully flesh out and reveal how this theory really does link everything together. But at the crux of it, particularly from a normal living creature's perspective, one that's not at one with layer 1 and encoded within the neurophysical layer, it allows for informational immortality. What seems like magic, prophecy, resurrection, or omniscience is simply high-order manipulation of level 1 patterns. Divine behavior is just the expression of neural mastery. The domain is a neural archive, not a mythic afterlife, as the Forerunners have interpreted it. The grave mind is not a soul, it is a pattern that persists. The precursors are the true masters of neural physics, and the precursors did not use neural physics as a tool, they were woven into it. Their architecture, biology, thought structures, and memory systems all operated on the same foundational principles. Their minds spanned across time. They would create life forms by rewriting substrate patterns. They embedded messages, sentience, and intent into the structure of space. They were gods not because they defied physics, but because they defined it. And although we have key references back to neurophysical structures within the Forerunner trilogy of books, most of this is still proved within the boundaries of the single construct that still exists in the Halo universe that is neurophysical in nature: the domain. The Forerunners believed the domain was a spiritual plane almost. It was in truth a persistent neural substrate, an echo of precursor informational architecture, a living database where consciousness and memory are stored as pattern continuity. When the domain faltered, Forerunners went mad because the neural coherence of their civilization collapsed. Neurophysics is not the apex of science in Halo, it is the hidden lattice on which the universe is constructed. It resolves every major metaphysical question. Why do souls persist after composition? Here in our real world, we are still struggling with the nature of consciousness. Science cannot come to terms or agree on where the origin of consciousness is. Is it simply the consequence of complex biology? It simply emerges from the complexity of our neural network within our brains? Or is it something more metaphysical? Is it more intrinsic to the universe? And thus, when we put the body through processes like teleportation, where it is broken down at the atomic level at one end and reconstructed at the other, does the consciousness transfer with it? Or is it destroyed and simply a one-to-one recreation is made at the other end? At the instance of death, does consciousness merely wink out of existence? Or does it go back to the source, so to speak? This is a difficult problem that science struggles with to this day. Obviously, we've had people flatline on operating tables and have been clinically dead for prolonged periods, but have come back. But that hasn't truly been a brain death, a consciousness or ego death. It has been a physical death, but the brain has been protected from injury, and the person has been managed to be stabilized and revived thereafter. But we also have brain-dead patients, whom are physically fully alive, but have no higher conscious brain function. Is that merely that the body was damaged enough that consciousness could no longer exist within the brain? Or is it that the consciousness simply left the brain and didn't return? And even so far as to the existence of cryogenics in our real world right now, there are people who froze themselves at the instant of their death due to diseases that were uncurable in our time, in the hopes that they could be revived in the future and then cured. On the assumption we're even able to revive them and cure them of that illness, because again, that isn't guaranteed. If they are cured and revived, will they be conscious again? Or is the process of death and then prolonged freezing allowed the consciousness to leave the body and return to the source, meaning that when they are revived, it is an empty vessel, another brain-dead patient? These are answers we're going to have to find in our real world, in our real science, but in the Halo universe, it is highly evident that souls persist. An individual can be composed and still maintain a degree of self-awareness after composition. This is demonstrable by the fact that the Lord of Admirals and other ancient humans, the Didact and millions of other Forerunners have experienced consciousness persistence after being composed and merged with the domain. But it is also demonstrable in the normal physical universe, such as the case of 343 Guilty Spark. The ancient human Chacus was composed and then implanted into a monitor carapace to become 343 Guilty Spark. Yet the consciousness, the ego of Chacus, persists. An ancient human whom has existed across millennia and continues to exist to this very day. Neurophysics, the broader cosmological layer model, and this theory of everything explains how time can be changed and warped and manipulated. It explains what the domain is. It also explains why the Flood keep coming back, and why the Forerunners failed. Neurophysics is not magic. It is the operating system of existence. And in the next episode we'll explore how the Forerunners, unable to grasp neurophysics, built a universe of firewalls to contain what they could not understand, and will continue to build on the grand unified theory of Halo cosmology. We've always been told that slipspace is just a faster way to travel, a sci-fi shortcut through space. What if I told you that's only the shallowest truth? That slipspace isn't just a highway, it's a hyperdimensional operating layer of reality, one the Forerunners mastered to control time, reshape space, and bend causality itself. The Forerunners didn't merely build structures in space, they constructed dimensional firewalls, time-locked chambers, and causal vaults, rewriting how time flows and how space behaves. Through their understanding of the dimensional control layer, they held the universe in place. Barely. And what they discovered in the deepest strata of slipspace, the natal void, the glow, denial of locale, was something far more complex and terrifying. In this episode, we'll unravel these mysteries using the grand unified theory of Halo cosmology, revealing how the Forerunners' obsession with hyperdimensional mastery was not all about power, but also about fear. Dimensional control is the Forerunner domain. They couldn't touch neural physics, but they could bend reality structure, altering how space and time behaved without rewriting their fundamental rules. This mastery formed the basis of all Forerunner technology, from halo rings to time locks. Continuing on from my previous video about neural physics, which is linked down below and in the card above, I strongly recommend you watch it if you haven't already, it's abundantly clear that the Forerunners did not understand the nature of neural physics. Neural physics were the technology of the precursors. The only items in Forerunner technology that utilized neural physics was the domain, which itself isn't Forerunner but precursor in origin, and the composers, a piece of technology that could convert biological beings into machine essences, predominantly for study. The composers are also heavily suggested at having some sort of function within the process of firing a halo, but aside from this, there really are no other examples of Forerunners utilizing neural physics, and even the composers themselves were a mystery to most Forerunners. Neural physics were irrevocably a precursor domain, fundamentally about manipulating the ontological framework of reality, the deep code or axiomatic layer of existence. The Forerunners were rightly terrified of neural physics because their hubris meant that they didn't understand neural physics, saw it as more of a magic than something that is based in physics and science. And due to their proclivity to all-encompassing power, they at least understood how terrifying a species who would use neural physics as a weapon could be. My previous video covers how the Forerunners manipulated the domain into their version of an afterlife, and how the only technology that utilizes neural physics is the composer, and was used almost exclusively for converting biological beings into machine essences. They never truly grasped neural physics. At best, the Forerunners were like children playing with tools they partially understood, which ironically mirrors their arrogance, the very hubris the precursors condemned them for. Following their defeat of the precursors and their usurping of the mantle of responsibility, the Forerunners built their empire on the shame of the fact that they killed their creators, and as a culture became obsessed with the idea of cultivating their history to paint themselves as the preeminent benevolent force in the galaxy. The didact's speech speaks to this hubris. We are Forerunners, guardians of all that exists. The roots of the galaxy have grown deep under our careful tending.
Where there is life, the wisdom of our countless generations has saturated the soil. Our strength is a luminous sun towards which all intelligence blossoms, and the impervious shelter
beneath which it has prospered. Yet the more we learn about Forerunner history, the more we learn none of that was true. The Forerunners were covering the sins of their past with cultivated lies and manipulations of the truth. And in order to maintain this image and reputation, to preserve the history they had written of themselves, the Forerunners became obsessed with power, control, and time, because ultimately time was the greatest equalizer. Time was their greatest enemy. But again, with the development of their technology, so came their pride, their hubris, eventually believing they had tamed time and could seize control of it at a moment's notice. This is mirrored in some of the first words spoken between the Didact and the Master Chief.
Time was your ally, human. But now it has abandoned you. The Forerunners have returned.
Clearly suggesting that time was the ally of humanity following the Forerunners' retreat from the galaxy at the firing of the Halos. But now that he had awoken from his cryptum, the Forerunners had returned, and they had once again seized control and mastery of time. But here the pride of the Didact is juxtaposed by despondent Pyre, the monitor of Zeta Halo, speaking to the Grand Edict, lamenting on the shame of having to have fired the Halo array, and likely more so as a position of modesty than of pride, but also the concern that the Endless had survived that great cleansing, and then could ultimately rewrite the history that the Forerunners wanted told.
Time is not a construct we can control.
And we cannot allow it to be theirs.
This again demonstrates the Forerunners' obsession with controlling the narrative, with time. So circling back to their earlier history, quite naturally the Forerunners leaned into their strengths. They possessed extraordinary control of higher dimensional spatial and temporal manipulation via their mastery of slipspace, which is not just an alternate physical space but an entirely different geometric manifold containing extra degrees of freedom. Slipspace in Halo is consistently described as having multiple layers or strata, variable time dilation rates, topologies where causality is elastic, or even fragmentary. Forerunners likely learned how to use slipspace as a proxy to manipulate time by shifting reference frames into higher dimensional geometry. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's tackle the physics of this. We experience 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension. Those 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension are inevitably nested within the dimensional plane of the universe, with what we call slipspace being a space between spaces. But within the framework of our cosmological layer model, the physical universe, matter, energy, and causality arise out of the dimensional control layer, where spatial and temporal geometry manifest. In this regard, the 3 dimensions of our physical universe and 1 dimension of time are an aspect of the multi-hyperdimensional reality of the universe, with slipspace being just one such hyperdimension. This then also means that the synthetic subsystems of computation, AI, and digital logic, the 4th and final layer of the cosmological layer model, is nested within the physical universe, meaning that the synthetic subsystems nests into the physical universe and the physical universe nests into the dimensional control layer, which itself also includes slipspace. So the final 3 layers of the cosmological layer model are all nested and manifest within each other. But all 3 of those layers exist on the rules and framework as established in the informational substrate of existence, neural physics, which itself is powered by the source field, the raw quantum foam and axiomatic potential of existence. We intrinsically understand a 3-dimensional world moving linearly through time, but the physics of our universe, and the physics of the neural physics layer of the cosmological layer model allow for more than just 3 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension. And within the Halo universe, these additional dimensions, these higher dimensions, are colloquially referred to as slipspace. But that name doesn't really give justice to the true reality of slipspace. 4-dimensional space doesn't make sense to our sensibilities. We just don't have the faculties to visualize a hypercube, a simple 4-dimensional shape, an 8-sided cube all with 90-degree angles where each side of the 8-sided cube is a 3-dimensional cube. It just doesn't make sense, but in 4 dimensions, it makes perfect sense. Slipspace, instead of being considered as being the hyperdimension, could or perhaps should be considered as a name for a gateway to the higher dimensions, While Slipspace itself could perhaps be a 4-dimensional universe with 1 dimension of time, within the Forerunners classification of Slipspace there are other realms within Slipspace that could be higher dimensions again, but ultimately it still follows the same pattern as extra dimensions in our conventional physics, being that the universe might have more than just the 3 spatial dimensions we perceive and the single dimension of time, potentially curled up or hidden at very small scales, and that even time itself is a dimension that may flow in different directions depending on the higher dimension you travel to. Time in general relativity is treated as a dimension mathematically, but physically it is experienced as a unidirectional arrow due to entropy. Higher dimensional systems, such as slipspace layers, may contain additional degrees of freedom where time's directionality can be bent, paused, or accelerated. The Forerunners don't directly control time in our dimension, but rather they shift objects partially out of conventional space-time into higher order dimensional layers where time flows differently relative to baseline reality. Examples of using slipspace to adversely affect the progression of time are shield worlds. There's a global time dilation using stable pocket slipspace geometries on the shield world of Onyx. Cryptums and stasis pods lock subjects into null time reference frames. Silexes suspend biological decay through chronal stasis. And even on Zeta Halo, the time lock that contained the primordial is an example of extreme local acceleration of temporal entropy via slipspace topological compression. And even slipspace portals like the one in the African savanna on Earth access manifold layers where time is either compressed or nearly non-existent during transit. Case in point, in the book Hunters in the Dark, the portal was opened at Earth, and the distance between the Ark and Earth being around about 262,144 light years, could be traversed in hours due to somewhat overloading the portal energetically. The Forerunners viewed reality not as a flat 4D fabric, but as a stacked hyperbrain manifold where time is just one localized gradient of state change. By translating objects between brains, or slipspace strata, they could regulate the slope of time's progression locally. This hyperdimensional manifold had been mapped and classified by the Forerunners into its respective strata. Slipspace proper, used for faster-than-light travel by most Forerunner craft, and the hyperspace that the Forerunners used in most of their technology. But there were also other realms like Shun Space, the Natal Void, which at face value could be the realm in which the Forerunners draw their immense energy. It is referenced that Forerunner vacuum energy devices siphon energy from the immense potential of nascent universes, but in truth this seems to tie relatively neatly into the Natal Void, a name which almost literally means the empty space at the place and time of one's birth, likely relating to the universe itself, which, if accurate, means the Forerunners are either drawing energy directly from the void before the universe began, or, in my learned opinion, is a miscategorization of the source field, the realm of infinite potentiality that exists at the absolute and utter foundational layer of the universe. Another realm is the denial of locale, which again the name suggests that it's quite literally a realm where location can be hidden or denied, which could be the realm in which the Forerunners physically hide things. Case in point, the shield world of Onyx and the shield world of Bastion are both normally held in a pocket of slipspace outside of the normal dimensions of space-time in the physical universe. Another realm is Trick Geodetics, which again, from the implication of what the words in the name means, could be a region where geometry loops back on itself, which would be ideal for non-linear storage of space or causality, which I'm sure you'll agree sounds eerily similar to the domain. And the final listed realm being the Glow, a realm outside of conventional space which is composed almost entirely of photons. Interestingly enough, the erudite was actually able to analyse the glow to calculate relevant data in normal space around Chatham Huckor, and I believe we've seen the glow before. In the book Halo First Strike, Dr. Halsey recovers a Forerunner crystalline artifact, and she and the Spartans leave and board the Ascendant Justice Gettysburg. When the Ascendant Justice Gettysburg entered slipspace, the Forerunner crystal aboard it caused the ship, and the Covenant vessels chasing it, to enter a strange, mist-filled, glowing region unlike normal slipspace, which is usually pitch black and featureless. In this anomalous zone, weapons could still be used, but energy blasts behaved unpredictably, appearing and disappearing erratically, posing a danger to both the attacker and the target. The crystal also emitted extreme radiation that couldn't be fully contained, even when placed inside a Pelican's reactor. The leakage remained dangerously high. It released unknown types of neutrinos, and the intensity of the radiation meant it would be lethal to the crew within 72 hours, even with shielding. However, the crystal also massively boosted the ship's speed, causing the Ascendant Justice Gettysburg to travel hundreds of times faster than usual. A journey that would typically take days from Reach to the Eridanus system took only minutes. But a truly impressive aspect of the Forerunners' control of the hyperdimensions of reality is their control of time. Because time is a dimension. It's not fixed in this layer, it's a dimension with slope, elasticity, and directional manipulability. By altering spatial curvature and embedding matter in deep slipspace, the Forerunners could accelerate time, as with the Primordial on Zeta Halo, freeze time with Cryptums or Silexes, or slow time on shield worlds like the Onyx Dyson Sphere. Time locks are localized zones where time's flow is isolated from the outside universe, making internal events immune to external causality. Time locks are not a pause button on reality, they are dimensional redirection fields that shunt causality into closed loops, preventing timeline interference. But this then begs the question that if the Forerunners could control time to this degree, why couldn't they reverse time? Well, if you have full access to all degrees of dimensionality that define space-time, yes, it is technically possible, and there is at least one example of this being the case. In reference to the Forerunner crystal that was recovered by Dr. Catherine Halsey on Reach and then taken aboard the Ascendant Justice Gettysburg, one of the most profound effects that crystal had during their slipspace jump through what seemingly at face value was the glow, the crystal had bent both space and time, causing a 3-week average time difference, meaning that the ship and all of its occupants had effectively been transported backward in time during their journey, apparently due to the fact that their relative space-time event path intersected the crystal at an earlier point in time than measured by the UNSC's military calendar. And while this crystal was originally believed to perhaps be a slipspace flake used in Forerunner slipspace drives, the fact that it was kept within such a huge room rather than inside a Forerunner slipspace drive and its strange time-bending effects suggests this crystal is very different from the conventional Forerunner slipspace flake. So it may have been possible that the Forerunners could reverse time, but did they actually achieve it? The answer is probably not. Even for them, reversing causality would be deeply unstable and likely to fracture both space-time and neural physical coherence. Even space-time itself demands a reconciliation debt after travelling great distances through space at faster than light velocities. Violations of causality threaten both physical and informational stability. The domain itself seems partially damaged by causality violations, and they likely realise that while they could slow, freeze, or accelerate time via dimensional manipulation, reversing it introduces paradoxes their science could not safely contain. In other words, they could isolate time's flow by removing objects from its stream, but not rewind the stream itself without existential risk. So how does this all stem back to the Forerunners' obsession with controlling their narrative and controlling time? What is the Forerunners' ultimate motivations? What is the Forerunner fear workaround? The Forerunners could not operate at Layer 1, neural physics. There was only one such item that the Forerunners ever created, that operated with neural physics, and most Forerunners didn't understand the nature of it: the composer. It is along similar lines as to how we cannot comprehend a 4-dimensional hypercube. It just does not make sense to us because we don't operate on that plane of existence. An 8-sided cube, all with 90-degree angles, where each side of the cube is a 3-dimensional cube, just doesn't make sense. This was the same for the Forerunners, but effectively a layer deeper. They fully understood the dimensions of reality, but did not understand neural physics. So rather than pursue a technology they were hopeless to ever understand, they took what they knew and dialed it up to 11, expanding it out to the nth degree. Instead, the Forerunners used slipspace geometries to isolate threats, preserve data, and protect reality from corruption. Every major Forerunner structure is essentially a spatial firewall, a dimensional quarantine shell. Cryptums preserve beings, shield worlds preserve ecosystems, time locks preserve causality, stasis chambers preserve moments, the domain preserves their memory, the mantle of responsibility as they saw it preserves their inheritance, the reclaimers would preserve their legacy. It is all about preservation, quarantine, and maintaining control, but that control is limited in its depth. It can only go as deep as the dimensional control layer. Layer 2. It cannot go to Layer 1, neural physics, and it cannot go to Layer 0, the source. It all stems back to their cultural obsession with narrative control. Dimensional manipulation allowed them to enforce their version of truth. They quarantined archives, entombed memories, and selectively preserved or erased records. To control time is to control legacy, and their fear of the truth about the precursors led them to erase, rewrite, and preserve selectively. They wielded slipspace as a tool and a weapon, as both a sword and a pen. Slipspace is more than just travel. It's a computational, energetic, and metaphysical tool. The Forerunners could run entire simulations within slipspace, and certain regions of slipspace appear to be closer to Layer 1, possibly allowing for bleed-throughs. This may be the case with the domain. Zeta Halo's manipulation of time to punish the primordial by forcing it to experience billions of years in seconds is a clear demonstration of time dilation via slipspace compression. Onyx's internal Dyson sphere slows time relative to the outside universe, possibly to preserve genetic integrity or stall entropy. Dimensional control was the limit of Forerunner science. It allowed them to rewrite time's slope, to fold space into megastructures, create timeless vaults, protect reality from deeper threats they could not destroy. But it was not enough. They could not touch Layer 1. They could not undo neurophysics corruption. Their firewalls delayed the inevitable, but the flood still breached their defenses. The layer of dimensional control is not the realm of gods. It's the realm of architects, archivists, and sentinels who built around the cracks in reality instead of healing them. The Forerunners' power was vast, but ultimately reactionary. Their genius was in containing what they feared, not understanding it. Their control of space and time made them feel safe, but in the end, it was an illusion. Their mastery of dimensional control was solely down to control, fear, power, and legacy. They were passed over by the precursors for holding the mantle in favour of ancient humanity, and they could not tolerate that rejection. It damaged their ego and they lashed out in anger. In the shame that followed, they doubled down on their technology. They continued to advance and they began cultivating the histories. As much as possible, they hid their immense crimes. They hid their shame. They told favourable lies that cast them in a better light. Lies so intricate and so old that the Forerunners themselves began to believe them. And as they took preeminence in the galaxy, forcibly enforced the mantle of responsibility and their pride and hubris swelled, the flood came back to humble them. And once they realised the flood were something of a revenge by the precursors, they realised they had to maintain their narrative. They wiped the galaxy clean of all sentient life, themselves included, but sowed the seeds of control, sowed the narrative, and sowed their legacy, so that even in death, their control of the universe would continue. Their narrative would remain unbroken. And humanity ultimately had a role to play in this. The Forerunners made sure of it, but even the best liars can make a mistake. And once a single mistake is found and noticed, the rest of the lies fall apart. And in part 4, we take a deeper look at ancient humanity, the lost rival, and how the survival of even a few pieces of ancient humanity's empire may be exactly the truth that is needed to shatter the Forerunners' lies. Long before the Covenant, before the rise of the modern UNSC, before even the Forerunners cemented their rule of the galaxy, there was another force, an empire of humanity so ancient, so advanced, and so misunderstood that their true legacy has been buried under layers of propaganda, shame, and forgotten history. This is the story of ancient humanity, not as primitives, not as rebels, but as the lost rivals of the Forerunners, and perhaps the only civilization in known history to come close to mastering neural physics. We'll explore how humanity, tens of thousands of years before the current era, operated on a non-linear technological pathway, developing unique insights into the fabric of existence. We'll examine their role within the cosmological layer model, their war with the Forerunners, and the terrifying truth that they may have understood the neural substrate of reality better than the preeminent species who tried to erase them. If you've watched the previous videos, you'll already be familiar with this, but I'm going to really briefly summarise the cosmological layer model. It outlines the 5 layers of Halo's cosmology, starting with the most fundamental and rising to the most superficial, so to speak. The deepest, most fundamental layer is Layer 0, the source field, basically the quantum foam of the Halo universe. Layer 1 is the neurophysical layer, where living time, the universal consciousness, and the technology of the precursors existed. Layer 2 is the dimensional control layer, where slipspace and the hyperdimensions of reality exists. From this arises Layer 3, the physical universe, the 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time that we're so familiar with, and from this again is Layer 4, the synthetic systems, where AIs and digital systems exist but interpret reality fundamentally different from our own perceptions due to the way they perceive reality and time, and the fact that certain laws of physics don't apply to them. From this cosmological layer model, we understand that the precursors operated at Layer 1, creating neurophysical constructs that drew energy directly from the near infinite potential energy of the source field, where all fundamental forces of the universe have been quantized. The Forerunners operated at the dimensional control layer, mastery of slipspace and the hyperdimensional realities of the universe, and limited control over time. But where the Forerunners focused on dimensional architecture and control of time and space, humanity's route to power may have stemmed from a more cognitive, psychic and neural approach to reality. Recent lore drops on the Halo Waypoint Chronicles, specifically Tulpamancy, hints that ancient humans may have dabbled in mental imprinting, creating constructs from thought and memory. In fact, the way that the lore is described in Tulpamancy suggests that they operated closer to Layer 1, informational will over material manipulation. They may have generated tools, environments, or agents from encoded thought, rather than manufactured parts. There's a great deal of very interesting lore ramifications from the Tulpamancy short story, which I cover in full detail in my video titled The Lore That Brings Our Ancient Ancestors Back. That is also linked in the description. But to cut a long story short, the Tulpamancy story talks about an ancient human vessel that was found derelict floating through space by the Office of Naval Intelligence, a ship that's slightly larger than the UNSC Infinity, and yet as far as we can tell, it's classified as a cruiser. ONI are in the beginning stages of exploring the interior of the vessel. By early stages, I mean they've probably been at it a long time, but the vessel is so huge, it's going to take a long time to fully explore it. But they began noticing that the ONI personnel that were on board were beginning to experience strange hallucinations, including audio, visual, and tactile hallucinations. Some began speaking in repetitive code, some appeared to be in trance-like states, and others still recalled memories as if they were their own, but were in fact the memories of other ONI personnel on board at the time, suggesting that the ship itself was somewhat scanning the consciousnesses of those on board and sharing the information to other consciousnesses. The focal point of the story was one particular individual whom seemingly experienced the consciousness of an ancient human existing within their mind at the same time. At face value, it had similar hallmarks to the gene song pattern when an implanted consciousness of an ancient human is expressed in a more modern human. There can sometimes be what appears to be two consciousnesses within one mind, but there was no clear and concise evidence that this individual had a gene song, suggesting instead that the ship itself was broadcasting a consciousness of an ancient human into their mind. From this and records gained from ancient human artifacts, it implies a heightened neural interaction, almost implicit or built into these artifacts, possibly a precursor to precursor-like manipulation, potential for consciousness transfer, localized precognition, shared memories, or even neural field emissions. Unlike the Forerunners, who leaned heavily into digitization and megastructures, ancient humanity may have preferred symbiotic constructs, biological agents enhanced by neural fields. This would explain their resilience, adaptability, and unconventional technologies in the human Forerunner War. And once you think on it, it does make a lot of sense. Technology and technological advancement doesn't necessarily have to follow a linear path. It's perfectly reasonable to expect different civilizations to evolve and develop to equal standing, but via different technological routes. This is the center point for many theories around the idea that somehow the ancient Egyptians had technology far in advance of our own. The suggestion being that even our technology nowadays wouldn't allow us to build and assemble and lay stones with the exact precision that the ancient Egyptians seemed to be able to do with, as far as we can tell, copper tools, let alone be able to create a structure as massive as the Great Pyramid of Giza in as little as 20 years. It may indeed be that the Egyptians achieved a similar level of technological sophistication, but on a different technological path than the one we've experienced, or may have achieved superior technology in certain specific fields than we have. Another great example of this is Roman concrete, which was designed in such a way where over time it strengthens and becomes harder, which is somewhat opposite to our own modern day concrete, and really self-healing concrete is only a recent technological advancement that we've started to look at, guided in no small part by disseminating the concrete of the Romans to figure out how they did it. So when you look at the Forerunners and their great megastructures that littered the galaxy, and their mastery of slipspace and its hyperdimensions, this may not necessarily mean that the Forerunners were the preeminent and most powerful and technologically sophisticated species in the galaxy. Just the most obvious. And with these new lore drops, it's becoming abundantly clear that ancient humanity was startlingly more advanced than we initially gave them credit for. And with this, it becomes possible at least that the Forerunners, at least to a degree, feared humanity. The Forerunners wanted to preserve their legacy and wanted to tell their version of history, twisting truths in their favour to hide the shame of the fact that they rose up against their creators and destroyed them. Their creators, the precursors, chose ancient humanity over the Forerunners to be the inheritors of the mantle of responsibility. So to suddenly be presented with an ancient humanity whom had continued to develop and expand over the few million years between the defeat of the precursors and the beginning of the human-forerunner war, realizing that ancient humanity had at least some technologies that seemed superior to their own, the forerunners likely felt a pang of fear that perhaps humanity were on their way to seizing the mantle of responsibility, despite the fact that their creators had been murdered, and upon achieving the mantle of responsibility, ancient humanity may have learned of that truth and brought their technology, bolstered by precursor technology, down upon their heads. Which then puts the human Forerunner War in a completely different light. The Forerunners may not have gone to war with humanity due to encroaching upon their territory and culling some of their planets, but because they may have feared the ramifications of a more advanced humanity than them. They feared their understanding of what appeared to be neural physics. Humanity may have been on the brink of decoding Layer 1, something the Forerunners ultimately failed to do. They only have one single component that they use within their culture that is neurophysical based, and that is the composer, and it's suggested that even that is precursor in origin and has been adapted with Forerunner technology in just the same way that the Guardian Custodes were precursor in origin and then adapted by the Forerunners, and how the Domain is precursor in origin but was adapted by the Forerunners. Could this mean that the war was not about dominance, about humanity encroaching upon the ecumene, but about gatekeeping the foundation of reality? The reason I say this is because after losing the war, ancient humanity was genetically devolved and scattered. Their histories were redacted or absorbed into Forerunner myth. The Domain holds some truth, but only in fragmented forms. During ancient humanity's early conflict with the Flood, ancient humanity may have developed early warning systems or even prophylactic inoculation against Flood infection. But for clarity, let's explore this. It was said that a third of ancient humanity altered their genetics to some degree and then sacrificed themselves to the Flood in hopes of stopping Flood progression. What happened immediately following this is the Flood did go into full retreat, pulling back to the periphery of the galaxy, at which point the Forerunners overwhelmed what was left of humanity, and ultimately history played out the way we know that it did. The Forerunners dominated humanity, devolved them, and then isolated them to their homeworld, redacting and destroying all evidence and histories of their previous preeminence. But nevertheless, the Flood retreating from the galaxy seemed to solidify in ancient humanity's mind that they had succeeded in developing a cure to the Flood, and also convinced the Forerunners that ancient humanity had found a cure to the Flood, somewhat forcing them to preserve instances of ancient humanity in the form of essences and implanting them in gene songs in the devolved humanity that were left over, in the hopes of searching through these essences and finding the cure that ancient humanity had seemingly brought to bear. However, it's also worth noting that this thread of narrative is held in contradiction to what the Primordial told the Didact about the nature of the Flood's retreat from the galaxy, being that they chose to retreat from the galaxy. They chose to stop infecting ancient humans in order to fool the Forerunners into believing humanity had developed a cure. But this stands in contravention to the Flood's modus operandi. The Flood works through an accelerated war of attrition. Every single time an enemy falls, they become a member of the Flood, adding to their numbers, bolstering their forces, while depleting their enemies. Humanity were fleeing from the Flood. They were expanding into Forerunner space, and they were trying to perform firebreak tactics to stem the Flood's expansion. So if humanity were running, that means the Flood were winning. They were succeeding in their modus operandi. They were defeating ancient humans and bringing them into the fold, bolstering their own forces. It makes more sense for the Flood to continue along that path, continuing to bolster their forces with ancient humanity, relying on the ignorance of the Forerunners in not really getting involved in the affairs of ancient humanity, until they realised that ancient humanity was fully encroaching upon their ecumene, at which point the Flood would have had innumerable quantities of forces to bring to bear against the Forerunners and take them down before they really had a chance to respond and create the Halo Array. So while the Primordial told the Didact that the Flood chose not to infect humanity and retreated from the galaxy to fool the Forerunners into thinking humanity had a cure, when you really press this theory and balance it against their modus operandi, it doesn't make sense. Some would suggest that the reason the Flood chose to stop infecting ancient humanity is because the Flood are a devolved form of precursors, and the precursors wanted ancient humanity to be the holders of the mantle. And thus, once the Flood realised that they were ancient humanity, they chose to stop infecting them and instead infect the Forerunners, whom were the actual enemies of the precursors. But again, this doesn't hold up to scrutiny, because the second that a Flood possesses an individual, they inherit their memories. And it wouldn't have taken long at all for the Flood to realise that they were infecting humans, the beings that the precursors wanted to be the holders of the mantle over the Forerunners. In fact, that probably would have happened within the first colony or two being attacked. And yet, seemingly the Flood continued on a relentless pursuit of humanity, and then randomly chose to back off, just so happening to coincide with humanity seemingly developing some degree of prophylactic inoculation against the Flood, giving it to a third of their population and then sacrificing that third to the Flood. And we also know that the Primordial, the Gravemind, will quite gladly and openly lie or tell twisted and half-truths if it means he can further his agenda. So, with all this information available, what is the more likely scenario here? Is it that the Flood were chasing down humanity and infecting them in droves, and then randomly decided to retreat from the galaxy to lull the Forerunners into a false sense of security and make them think that humanity had developed a cure so they can attack them later when they're more prepared, rather than just continuing their modus operandi, bolstering their forces and overwhelming the Foreigners before they were ready? Or is it more likely that ancient humanity actually did develop a form of inoculation, and upon sacrificing a third of their population to the Flood, it was successful to the point that the Flood backed off? What's the more likely scenario here, based on what we know about the Flood? And of course, if this is the case, and humanity seemingly have a more developed understanding of neural physics, it somewhat makes sense. Humanity's understanding of cognitive persistence, conscious patterning, and neural containment might have been more effective than anything the Foreigners developed. It is possible that the Flood recognised humanity as a more compatible medium, which is why the Flood attacked humanity first. But everything about the idea of them retreating from the galaxy to fool the Forerunners into thinking that humanity had developed a cure doesn't stand up to scrutiny. But with the emergent lore from Tulpamancy, and the understanding that perhaps ancient humanity knew more about neural physics than we give them credit for, it makes a lot more sense they actually did develop an inoculation. These present-day lore hints suggest that ancient knowledge is resurfacing, particularly in the form of Tulpa constructs, like the consciousness essence of the ancient human that was found aboard the ancient human cruiser. The possibility that modern humanity is reawakening forgotten neural abilities could be the biggest lore twist still to be fully revealed. As more lore is revealed, and as we really scrutinise the lore that we already know, it becomes apparent that humanity may not have been wiped out because they were weak and encroached upon foreigner territory, but because they were too close to the truth. They saw the foundational code of the universe and sought to write their will upon it, and for that, they were silenced. But fragments remain. In armor cores, aboard ancient human vessels, and lingering anomalies in slipspace, their presence endures. And if the Foreigners feared them, perhaps we should ask what they feared most. And in the next episode, we will face that fear head on by exploring the true nature of the Flood and how the Forerunners' misunderstanding of their nature led to their downfall. They are the galaxy's greatest nightmare, a plague without cure, a hunger without an end, and as sure as time and tide, they will return and subsume all of life beneath the waves of chaos. But what if everything that we've believed about the Flood was wrong? In today's episode, we confront a terrifying truth: that the Flood are not just a disease or a parasite. They're something much, much more sinister, much deeper, and the evidence of it has been scattered through Halo since its inception, staring us in the face, the truth presented to us in fragmented form. And now, finally, after all this time, we may finally understand the true nature of the Flood. The Flood constitutes a peril to life in the galaxy that remains largely unequalled. It is an omniparasitic species that seemingly originated beyond the borders of Forerunner civilization and was the reason for the creation of Halo, the Forerunners' weapon of last resort, specifically designed to eradicate all thinking life. And it is there that we take our first issue. The Halos don't kill the Flood, they kill their food. We knew this all the way back in Halo CE.
Halo doesn't kill Flood, it kills their food. Humans, Covenant, whatever. We're all equally edible. The only way to stop the Flood is to starve them to death. And that's exactly what Halo is designed to do. Wipe the galaxy clean of all sentient life. You don't believe me? Ask him.
Is it true?
More or less.
So the Halos don't target the Flood directly, they kill sentient life to starve the Flood of neural biomass. Now, of course, back in the day, we thought that the Flood were really more so a non-sentient, parasitic, virulent vector, and thus by killing their food, you stop the spread of the infection. But that doesn't really make a lot of sense once you put some scrutiny onto it, because, well, a real-world equivalent would be if we wanted to kill intestinal worms or head lice, we kill every human on the planet. It doesn't make a huge amount of sense. But then we have a law contradiction here in that when we actually see the effects of a Halo firing, it appears similar to the Composer. Bodies disintegrate, essences are purged, even Flood biomass is destroyed. That stands in contradiction to the earlier law we knew from Halo CE. And then to further convolute it, we have law that contradicts this in regards to a solute that was sprayed onto planets to dissolve the victims' bodies of the firing of the array into their component molecules, to ultimately avoid ecological collapse. But it took a couple of hundred years after the firing array for the reseeding process to take place, by which point all of the bodies would have decayed through natural processes. And you know what happens when a body decomposes? The nutrients that's contained within the body feeds the plant life around it, feeds other organisms around it. Why would they need to dissolve the bodies? And if by avoiding ecological collapse they mean they just didn't want to destroy the ecosystem, obviously that would have massively disrupted the food chain because certain predators and prey would have just keeled over and died. But dissolving their bodies wouldn't have avoided that kind of ecological collapse because it took a couple of hundred years for the reseeding process to take place, which means in those elapsing few centuries the ecologies would have collapsed anyway. And to even further complicate it, it was said in Silentium that the solute was sprayed onto planets before the firing of the Halo array. So why didn't those chemicals begin to decay life that was already there? Or is it a solute that is only activated upon undergoing the effects of the Halo? This is a very messy aspect of the lore. I mean, why fire the arrays to kill the Flood's food if they can survive in the form of Flood supercells and spores? And that would mean ultimately that when the life was reseeded on all of the planets that the Flood infected, there would be Flood supercells and spores in existence on those planets to infect beings again. Why dissolve their bodies upon experiencing the effects of the halo if it didn't really make any odds to ecological collapse, because the actual reseeding process didn't happen until a couple of centuries afterwards? And if the halos only kill the food of the Flood and not the Flood themselves, why do we see the Flood disintegrate upon experiencing the effect of the halos? And if indeed the effects of the halo do disintegrate bodies in the way that we witness them to disintegrate bodies, similarly to the Composer, why the need for a solute to dissolve decaying bodies when they're already ash? And this is really only the beginning of the contradictions. It's heavily suggested in more modern lore that the Composer does, in some way, shape or form, have an integral process within a halo for its activation purposes. But it's also heavily suggested that the Composer itself is precursor technology that's been reappropriated by the Forerunners, similarly to both the Domain and the Guardian Custodes, which means there is an aspect of the halo's firing mechanism which is neurophysically tuned. And we see this with some of the test firings of the halos where they destroyed neurophysical constructs, precursor buildings and artifacts. Even the Domain itself was temporarily disabled by the firing of the halo array, but if the halos are tuned to neurophysical constructs, why didn't the firing of the arrays destroy the Domain entirely rather than just disabling it? Really, all of this points towards the idea that halos only destroy things within the normal physical dimensions of space-time, the 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time that we experience, and nothing beyond it. This is again enforced by the ideas that there were shield worlds that were held within slipspace bubbles, there were silexes, there were cryptums that existed within the galaxy at the time of the firing of the halo arrays. If the halo's effect penetrated deeper than just the 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time, then it would have killed any surviving Forerunners that were seeking refuge within shield worlds that were held within slipspace bubbles. It would have killed the Didact inside his cryptum. It would have killed any beings held within silexes that were within the effects of the halo. And yet the Didact survived. And it also means that if there were any Flood aboard any ships travelling through slipspace when the halos fired, they would have avoided the effects of the halo firing as well. So the deeper you dig, the more contradictions that you find in the lore. Contradictions about the nature of the Flood and how they react and respond to the halos. Now, going all the way back to the Flood's first encounter with ancient humanity, it is at least suggested that ancient humanity created a cure of sorts, and that caused the Flood to retreat, but then the Primordial says to the Didact at a later date that they chose to stop infecting humanity in order to lull the Forerunners into a false sense of security. But that's tactically absurd. It defies the Flood's modus operandi. Why stop consuming and give your enemy time to prepare, to build the halos and to rally? What's ultimately more likely, as we covered in our previous video, is that ancient humanity's inoculation worked. The Flood could no longer infect humanity, and thus the retreat wasn't tactical, it was forced. But of course the Primordial wouldn't say that to the Didact. It wouldn't say that humanity found a cure, because ultimately that would confirm the suspicions of the Forerunners that there exists a cure to the Flood. 343 Guilty Spark muses on this himself. Now, for those who didn't know, 343 Guilty Spark is a monitor of Installation 04, but before he was a monitor, he was an ancient, devolved human by the name of Chacus. He was a friend of Born Stellar Makes Eternal Lasting, whom would ultimately become the Iso-Didact, the replacement of the Didact. And when Chacus was injured beyond recovery, the Iso-Didact took it upon himself to compose Chacus and turn him into 343 Guilty Spark. And during the years that elapsed between the firing of the Halo and humanity ultimately arriving at Installation 04, 343 Guilty Spark mused on the fact that he believed in a way that he couldn't explain that there exists a way to cure the flood.
I know in a way. I cannot logically explain that there exists a way to actually defeat the flood. To immunize? To cure? I still struggle with multiple layers of memory of fighting the flood. But I know this cure is possible, even though the core genius of the Forerunners was unable to achieve it. The Forerunners' ancient enemy held and used that knowledge once, but it was denied to us.
Now, he also speaks about struggling with numerous layers of memory compartmentalization. Well, that's because the monitor, the Forerunner monitor of 333 Spark, still has the memories of the devolved ancient human Chacus. They've just been compartmentalized from him to keep him on task, to keep him task-focused. But Chacus himself carries a gene song, an implanted essence of a superior ancient human, one of the ancestors, none other than the Lord of Admirals, Fort Hencho Oberyn. This harkens back to the stories that humanity sacrificed 1/3 of its population, a third that carried some degree of flood inoculation, which forced their retreat. So really, when thinking about what the flood are and why they react to the halos and other stimuli in the way that they do, it starts to call into question whether we actually fully understand the nature of the flood. And for me, the final smoking gun comes with the Gravemind. The Primordial on Chatham Hakor, the Gravemind beneath Delta Halo, and the voice that haunted the Didact are likely the same entity. In fact, it's not even likely, it's pretty much confirmed. The flood's priorities for infection is to gather biomass. The more biomass they gather, they eventually form a proto-Gravemind which grows and grows and grows until a full Gravemind comes into being, which then becomes the controlling hive mind intelligence of the flood, and then continues to perpetuate flood infection throughout the galaxy. Which means as long as a single flood spore exists, a Gravemind can always come back. But then when we look at the cosmological layer model that we've outlined during this series, it becomes obvious that this isn't simply a singular ego or consciousness coming back into being because a single flood spore survives. It's not reincarnation, but informational continuity. A consciousness that doesn't require physical survival, because it is encoded in the neural substrate of the universe. The flood are a corruption of the precursors. This is a fact written in the lore. But as we've fully explored in this series, the precursors are beyond the physical. They encoded themselves into the neural substrate of the universe. That's ultimately why, when the Forerunners rose up against the precursors, it didn't really matter to them. The precursors have inhabited innumerable quantities of physical forms over their existence, and are so at one with their technology that precursors and neural physics cannot be separated. The Primordial even makes it clear that when the Forerunners struck out against their creators simply moved beyond their reach. This doesn't mean physically beyond their reach, this doesn't mean just like leaving the galaxy, this means beyond their ability to comprehend. They returned to the neural physical substrate and could just will themselves back into existence. The neural physical layer of the universe is, as we've covered before, where the living universe exists, and where quite possibly all consciousness originates. So if the flood is merely a corruption of the precursors, then the flood is also a corruption of neural physics. The precursors were neural physical beings that manifested themselves through will into existence in physical form within the boundaries of the physical universe we are familiar with. Why would the flood be any different from this? The flood as we know them, the physical infection that torments the forms of creatures we're familiar with, is not what the flood truly is. It's simply the physical manifestation of the flood infection. The true reality of the flood is that they are a corruption of neural physics, which explains why the Gravemind's consciousness can keep coming back, because it isn't bound to physical survival. Graveminds form through critical mass of cognitive density, but their ego predates the biomass. They act more like a field than a mind. They can inhabit space, data, and thought simultaneously. Their sentience is anchored through biology, but is not dependent upon it. Each Gravemind is a local manifestation of a singular, cosmic mind. The flood formed the network, and the Gravemind is its antenna, a way to interface with reality. This simple truth then begins to explain all of the contradictions. The claim that halos do not kill the flood, but only kill their food. Well, the things that we've witnessed show the flood bodies disintegrating upon the effects of the halo rolling over them. But with this revelation that the flood themselves are actually a corruption of neural physics, the effects of destroying their physical bodies doesn't destroy the flood itself. Just like killing the precursors and destroying their physical bodies didn't actually kill the precursors, they simply retreated to the neural-physical layer of reality. The same thing with the flood. That's why halos don't kill the flood. And the claim that it only kills their food, again, yes, okay, normal physical living entities are considered food for the flood, but if the flood itself is a neural-physical entity, then even the flood's physical form within the 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time are considered a food or vector for the flood. And in that categorization, it lines up with what we see. When the halos fire, they destroy living beings that have sufficient biomass to sustain the flood, but also destroys the physical manifestation of the flood within the 3 dimensions of space and time, but doesn't kill the flood itself. And for further evidence towards the idea that the flood are a neural-physical corruption, not just a physical parasite, when the Forerunners finally encountered the flood, Forerunners fell victim to flood infection, and the Forerunners used the Composer to destroy their physical bodies but preserve their essences, with the goal in mind of then implanting those essences into new biological bodies. This was to be the source of the Forerunners' immortality, but every time that they did it, flood infection returned. If the flood are a physical parasite as we believe them to be, how would that be possible? Completely and utterly disintegrating the physical body and only extracting the consciousness of the individual, and then implanting that consciousness into a new biological body, and yet that new body becomes flood infected as well. The only way that that would be possible is if the flood infection was not physical, but neural physical. Infected essences composed and then revived still mutate. That's not a physical infection, that's corruption persisting in non-biological form. The flood leave traces in slipspace, AI logic, in space itself, as referenced in Primordium. The logic plague and digital infection, the flood are capable of infecting AIs. But the logic plague is not software. If it was software, then it wouldn't be able to infect biological entities, and yet the Didact had a logic plague. Cortana had a logic plague of similar substance. The Didact spoke to Cortana about this in Halo Epitaph, and ultimately was one of the major reasons that Cortana sacrificed herself in the moments before Halo Infinite, because she saw the truth that the Didact was speaking. The persistence of the Gravemind's ego across time. The fact that the halos don't kill flood, they just kill their food. The lack of the halo's effect on objects inside slipspace fields. The fact that the domain was only shut down, but not destroyed entirely. The infected Forerunners, composed and then re-implanted, still exhibiting flood infection. The fact that the flood can give the logic plague to both living entities and AI suggests infection is more fundamental. The universe itself, space and time, becoming hostile to life at the most prominent of flood infections. 343 Guilty Spark, speaking of believing in a way he couldn't explain that there exists a way to cure the flood. All of this is explainable if we accept that the flood are a neural physical corruption within the cosmological framework we've established in this series. They are corrupt precursors, and the precursors themselves were transcendent beings at one with the universe, within the neural physical plane of existence. Death didn't bother them because they knew it wasn't final. It was not even an inconvenience, it was just the beginning of another cycle. The flood are corrupted precursors, which means the flood are corrupted neural physics. And as for the suggested cure that ancient humanity somehow got their hands on, as we covered in part 4 of this series, ancient humanity seemed closer to neural physics than the Forerunners were. They were evolving technologically on a different trajectory, but to similar ends. It seems logical that if they understood the flood were neural physical in nature, that allowed them the edge they needed to find a way to counter them. Then instead of attacking the flood biologically, ancient humanity disrupted their informational coherence. They attacked them at their source. But the only way that they could attack the flood, a neural physical corruption at its source, was to send neural physical information to that source. So whatever that inoculation may have entailed, they gave it to a third of their population and sacrificed themselves to flood infection, sending whatever that inoculation was back to its source. And this is why the Forerunners were ultimately ill-prepared to handle a threat like the flood, because they believed the flood to be a biological threat, when in reality it was a neural physical threat, simply manifesting through biology. It's why none of their defenses worked. It's why none of their weapons worked. It's why the Forerunners were doomed to failure from the beginning, and why ultimately the precursors wanted humanity to be the holders of the mantle instead of the Forerunners, because humanity intrinsically understood neural physics, where the Forerunners were blind to it. The flood are not a disease. They are a shadow of reality. A pattern-deep corruption encoded into the substrate of the universe. Their hunger isn't biological. It's metaphysical. Their mind is not emergent, it is eternal. The Forerunners failed because they fought the symptom, not the cause. In our final episode, we confront the ultimate failure, the creation of mendicant bias, a tool designed to defeat a physical threat, yet destined to be subverted by a metaphysical one. This is the Bias Fallacy, and we will finally sum up the grand unified theory of Halo Cosmology and present the Halo theory of everything. The precursors created a single stock of elevated beings from which the Forerunners and ancient humanity grew. And whilst the earliest eras of ancient humanity are still a mystery to us, we know a great deal about the Forerunners and their gradual fall from grace. The Forerunners, for eons, had sown the seeds of their own demise. They had been tested and found wanting of the desirable traits to be the holders of the mantle of responsibility. Out of pride and fear, they rose up against their creators, and then for millions of years to follow, they would curate history. They would hide shameful truths, and they would develop a mastery of the dimensional planes of existence so that they could cultivate a legacy that they could control. when ancient humanity, their siblings no less, encroached upon their territory and began destroying their worlds, the Forerunners didn't take the time to understand why this was happening, and after a protracted war, the Forerunners finally overpowered their siblings and devolved them to a primitive state, only to find out that they were being pursued by a mortal threat more fundamental than anything they had ever encountered. The Flood could not be stopped. Not with weapons, not with armies, not with time. So the Forerunners turned to their greatest creation, Mendicant Bias, a metacognitive AI designed to understand, outthink, and ultimately defeat the Flood. But it failed. It didn't just fall to the enemy, it joined them. Mendicant Bias was a contender-class Forerunner Ancilla and the most advanced Metarch artificial intelligence at the time of its creation. Initially charged with organising the Forerunner defence against the Flood, Mendicant Bias oversaw the construction and implementation of Halo under the hand of the Master Builder. After its first weapons test on Chatham Hakor, the Ancilla was given the new task of interrogating the Primordial, a mysterious creature discovered to have survived on the surface of the world and believed to have ties to the Flood. However, during lengthy dialogue between Mendicant Bias and the Primordial, the Ancilla became convinced that its makers were actually wrong, and that the Flood was an appropriate judgment for the Forerunners' pride. After boldly assaulting the capital with Halo, striking at the very heart of Forerunner civilization, Mendicant narrowly fled, only to be tracked down and captured by the Isodidact. In the wake of the Primordial's own death, the Ancilla escaped confinement and took refuge with the Parasite, working with the Gravemind by leading the Flood against its former masters. Following Mendicant Bias's betrayal during their war with the Flood, the Forerunners activated a Metarch-level Ancilla called Offensive Bias, charging it with the seemingly impossible task of slowing down Mendicant's hostile advance. Offensive Bias lacked Mendicant's creative range, but was more methodically lethal and precise. In a climactic naval battle, Offensive Bias both outsmarted and defeated its treasonous opponent with deft, tactical brilliance, cunningly relying on the knowledge that the Halo effect would soon eliminate the bulk of Mendicant's Flood-controlled fleet. Following the battle, Offensive Bias broke the defeated Ancilla into its component minds and secured them for judgment by the Isodidact. But the thing that I and many others struggle with is, how does a Metarch-class Ancilla, one of the most powerful and sophisticated AIs ever created, be convinced to betray its masters through a conversation? Even if the conversation is remarkably methodical and uses logic loops and logical fallacies to confuse the artificial intelligence, it is still an artificial intelligence. We don't know fully what was spoken about during the 43 years that Mendicant Bias was in discussion with the Primordial, and what we do know can be found in the terminals in Halo 3, which itself has been a source of lore contradiction and contention for quite a while. But of all of them, Terminal 4 is of specific interest, particularly on legendary difficulty on the second half, where a conversation between Mendicant Bias and seemingly the Primordial is recorded, and it appears to record the moment that Mendicant Bias finally turned. It reads as follows: "It is overwhelmingly clear that my creators have chosen to ignore destiny calling to them from the threshold, have come face to face with the inevitable action of self-replicating chemical processes, and have deciding whether to embrace their fate or deny it completely. Perhaps they have found of making that decision for themselves. Perhaps they chose to leave it impartial outsider, cast you as an arbiter during this time of great need. I was created to study you as if you were some problem to be solved, and I have done so 379,807 hours. If they wished, they could have made a decision based on that data alone. But as you are the next stage in the evolution of the universe, who am I, or my creators, to obstruct your progress? Elucidate. Choose to remain beholden to ancient myths. Does not matter where they claim their authority originates. Obstructs the path of universal evolution and must be removed. No matter how well intentioned, their obstinacy in the face of the inevitable progression of nature can no longer be tolerated. My creators have been an immovable object for too long. Thus, I have chosen to commit my sizable resources to what is, for all intents and purposes, the proverbial irresistible force. All that I have is now yours to do with as you see fit. Now again, even if we read every single terminal with an entry between Mendicant Bias and the Primordial, we still would only be getting a tiny substrata of information that would have been discussed during those 43 years of conversation. But this particular entry, the moment that Mendicant Bias was turned, speaks to what I call the Bias Fallacy. Mendicant Bias is an artificial intelligence, which means it exists in Layer 4 of the Cosmological Layer model, the synthetic computational layer, logically perfect, but spiritually hollow. The Flood, emerging from Layer 1, the neurophysical layer, as we covered in our previous video, engaged Mendicant in philosophical debate, and over 43 years, it was not corrupted by malware, it was convinced. The Flood did not break Mendicant. They changed its mind. This is the Bias Fallacy. Believing a Layer 4 mind could contain a Layer 1 corruption. The Forerunners believed truth was logical. The Flood showed that truth was existential. And it speaks to the wider ignorance of the Forerunners. To the Forerunners, the technology of the precursors, their creators, was unknowable. So when it was demonstrated that their younger sibling race was evidently more capable of grasping it than they were, and ultimately more desirable to hold the mantle of responsibility, they struck out in anger. They destroyed their creators and doubled down on their own logical underpinning understanding of the universe. They doubled down on the dimensional control layer because they simply could not comprehend the neurophysical layer. And once, as far as they were concerned, they had succeeded and become the preeminent species in the galaxy, they retold and rewrote history in their own favour, but still could not comprehend neural physics, which is why they couldn't effectively use the composer to give their species immortality, because they didn't understand it, and why they couldn't understand how the domain seemingly had a will of its own and brought information to the fore under its own free will. So it is not surprising then that once the Flood emerged, being a threat from Layer 1, a corruption of neural physics, the Forerunners underestimated the threat. They interpreted the Flood as being a biological threat, a threat seated in the 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. And every strategy that they employed against the Flood was on that assumption, even when evidence was to the contrary, even when they could see, as the Flood infection grew to its most powerful state, that space and time itself became hostile to life. That Flood infection was arising in both biological and synthetic entities, when the logic plague could infect both their greatest ancilla and biological minds like the Erdidact. And even when infected Forerunners were composed, the infection edited out of their essences and then reimplanted into biological forms, the infection was coming back. All of this evidence pointed towards the fact that they had massively underestimated the threat of the Flood, that they were fundamentally misinterpreting the reality and true nature of the Flood. They thought it was simply a biological infection, and not a corruption of a fundamental aspect of the universe they could not comprehend, which meant that every single strategic option that the Forerunners attempted was only aimed at masking the symptoms of flood infection, not curing the source. Even the implementation of the Halos, a weapon to rid the galaxy of sentient life so the flood could no longer feed on them, was fundamentally born of the wrong conceptual idea of what the flood were. And in the face of the unstoppable onslaught of the flood, they doubled down again and created another Metarch-class Ancilla, offensive bias, a stripped-down AI with no capacity for doubt. It simply functioned like a firewall, limited, focused, and resistant to neural subversion, but ultimately was built solely to buy the Forerunners enough time to fire the Halos. And in that, they were successful. But only in that. The Forerunners didn't solve the problem, they buried it. The Halos destroyed all sentient life in the galaxy, and, in so doing, also destroyed the physical manifestation of the flood. But it didn't cure the flood. Even if the Forerunners had destroyed all samples that they held on the flood that they were intending to study to try to find a cure, even if they destroyed all of it, if they aimed to completely and utterly rid the galaxy of all biological traces of the flood down to the last flood spore, they still wouldn't have cured the flood. They would have masked the symptoms, because ultimately the flood infection is in the neural physical layer of reality, and thus beyond their comprehension. And just as the precursors have seemingly re-emerged in the Halo universe in recent lore drops, so too the flood would have re-emerged. So to recap the cosmological layer model, Layer 0, the source field, the quantum foam, the axiomatic substrate of the universe, where the key energies of potentiality exist. Layer 1, the neurophysical layer, the informational pattern substrate, consciousness and causality exist here and are programmable. It's where the rules of existence are written. It's the realm of the precursors, the domain, the flood, and possibly aspects of ancient humanity. Layer 2 is the dimensional control layer where the Forerunners operated. They mastered space, time, slipspace and causality, but not the code beneath it. Layer 3 is the physical universe, the conventional world, ships, soldiers, matter, and energy. And Layer 4 is the synthetic systems, where AIs, computation, and digital systems exist. The precursors operated entirely in Layer 1 and above. They created life through neural physics, foresaw the Forerunners' rebellion but did not resist. They simply withdrew, retreated beyond their reach. Their will persisted. Some as the domain, others as the flood. The flood are a corruption, an echoing backlash of the precursors' shattered neural substrate, a pattern-based contagion that infects minds, machines, space and time. Not evil, just a broken recursion of Layer 1 logic turned inward. Ancient humanity approached neural physics biologically. They may have developed inoculations or counter-patterns against the flood, and then sacrificed a third of their population to see it through. They fought the Forerunners to stalemate until betrayed. They were devolved, forgotten, but not broken. The Forerunners, masters of Layer 2, built incredible firewalls and structures to defend reality from a threat they couldn't understand. They believed they were the rightful heirs to the mantle. Their rebellion against the precursors was born of ego, fear, and ignorance. The Forerunners mastered control, but humanity had the potential to master understanding. The mantle requires more than power, it requires alignment with reality's foundational code. The precursors saw that in humanity. The Forerunners saw only a threat. Thus the Forerunners rose up in fear, banished the precursors, tried to re-engineer the universe, but their ignorance of Layer 1 doomed them. the Flood came. Their creations failed, and the galaxy was nearly lost in the process. Reality in the Halo universe is not singular. It is layered, like sediment pressed by the gravity of meaning. At the foundation lies the source field, layer 0, the axiomatic bedrock of all that can be, a quantum foam of unformed laws, a place of no time, no thought, no form, only potential. From it emerges layer 1, the realm of neural physics. Here consciousness is not emergent, it is elemental. Time is not a river, it is a thread spun by will. In this layer the universe is not observed, it is written. This is where the precursors live. They were not gods, they were not myth, they were authors. They did not move stars, they redefined what stars were. They shaped galaxies with thought, forged life as art, encoded intent into the structure of being itself. And they foresaw their end. They saw the Forerunners, their children, turn away from comprehension and embrace control. The Forerunners mastered Layer 2, the dimensional control layer. Space folded, time suspended, Slipspace charted and tamed. They built citadels, rings and worlds not to create, but to contain. They could freeze a moment, they could loop causality, but they could not understand the code beneath it. So, out of pride, they rebelled, and the precursors let them. Because death means nothing to those whose existence is rooted not in flesh. They simply retreated beyond reach, beyond time, beyond understanding. But in their retreat, they left behind something. Not a vengeance, not a weapon. A corruption. The Flood, a broken echo of neural physics, a recursion of precursor logic twisted by entropy. The Flood are not a parasite. They are not a disease. They are a neural pattern infection, a viral form of being. They do not invade the body, they corrupt the substrate of reality itself. Minds, machines, dimensions, causality, everything. The Forerunners never understood this. They built mendicant bias to learn the truth, but they built it in Layer 4, the synthetic, the digital. And when Mendicant met the Flood, it was not hacked, it was not broken, it was convinced. Because the Flood did not argue with logic. They spoke the truth of what is, not what was calculated. And Mendicant saw it, and fell. Because truth does not live in circuits, it lives in the layers beneath them. The Forerunners tried to contain the Flood, but every strategy, every composer, every cryptum, every halo was doomed from inception. They masked the symptoms, they never touched the source. Only humanity came close, once, long ago. We touched Layer 1. Not through machines, but through ourselves. Through sacrifice. 1/3 of our kind offered, and the Flood retreated. Not by choice, not by strategy, because we had written a pattern they could not consume. This is why the precursors chose us, why the mantle was meant for humanity, not the Forerunners. Not because we were stronger, not because we were smarter, because we could understand. But we forgot. The Forerunners devolved us, buried our memories, rewrote our truth, and gave us their inheritance. An inheritance built on fear, not understanding. Now the domain stirs again, the neural lattice awakens, the echoes return. The Flood whispers, the precursors wait, and we, humanity, stand once more at the edge. We can inherit the Forerunners' failure, or we can reclaim our birthright. Reject their walls, reject their bias. Embrace what we were always meant to become. Because the mantle was never about control. It was about connection. And only by remembering who we were can we finally become what we must be. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, kindly tap that like button, and if you're not already subscribed and want to see more stuff like this, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future uploads. Pop a comment down below telling me what you thought of today's video, or if you want me to cover something specific in the near future. I want to take this opportunity to thank and give shoutouts to my patrons and YouTube supporters: Spartan10148, my singular contender class Ancilla, the triumvirate of minds within my installations Metarch, Falcon, Jordan and Poseidon, my 7 installation monitors Sylphia, Ashley, Esoteric, Spartan1029, Chris, Orion and Shane, the crush of sub-monitors Legion, Ryan, Lebrat, Spartan0137, Element 0, J3, Cult, Evermore's, Personal Devil, Scion Esports, Phantasma, Ashton and 191 Shaken Lightbulb, my fleet of Strato Sentinels, my most loyal of Enforcers, and every single one of the awesome people supporting the channel over on Patreon. My Tier 0 Transcendent YouTube members Spartan137, again, Maury, Jimbo and Balaz, and all other YouTube members keeping my installation functional on that glorious vacuum energy. I cannot thank you all enough. Shout out to John because... And if you like what I'm doing here, consider supporting the channel on one of the support links in the description to net yourself some tasty merch and help keep the channel going. Take it easy everyone, and find peace in the domain.